This short story video will be looking at The Landlady by Roald Dahl. In the video I'll give a short introduction explaining the context, then there'll be the audiobook with a read along section with highlighted parts and a text aid box for difficult vocabulary, and there'll be extra analysis from myself. So here we have several pictures and book covers for The Landlady. Based on these, what do you think the story might be about? What predictions can you make? What might the tone of the story be? Is it a scary one, a happy one? What do you think? What about the characters? Who might the antagonist be? Who might the protagonist be? What about the setting, the plot? What sort of things can you take away from these images? Let me know in the comments, please. Next, context. So, Roald Dahl, born in 1916 in Wales, part of the UK. He's the author of many children's books, including BFG, Matilda, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, The Twits, The Witches, all sorts. Now, The Landlady was published in 1959 in the New Yorker magazine, and it actually won the Edgar Award for Best Short Story. It was published again in 1960 in the New Yorker as well. Now here we have Roald Dahl and a number of his books. Now I'm a massive Roald Dahl fan. I love them. I love James and the Giant Peach. I love Fantastic Mr. Fox. I think he's brilliant. Now Dahl's father died at the age of 3, and because of this Dahl was sent to several boarding schools here. At these boarding schools he was treated poorly by teachers. They would cane students, they would bully students, and this might be why many of the protagonists in Roald Dahl stories are young people. They're kids, they're teenagers, and many of the antagonists are older people. They're teachers, they're older adults. This could be why his experiences have come through in his work. Now, when you're reading The Landlady, there are a few things I want you to pay particular attention to. First, what themes can you spot? What is Dahl's message in The Landlady? How is suspense built in the story, particularly with foreshadowing? What foreshadowing can you spot? What is the tone when describing the landlady, the house, the animals? And how are the characters, how are Billy, the protagonist, and the landlady characterized? Specifically their image versus their actions. Now, just to let you know, Billy is the protagonist in the story. It's written from a third person limited perspective. We know what Billy's thinking, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed the story, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you.
The Landlady by Roald Dahl. Billy Weaver had travelled down from London on the slow afternoon train with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about 1/4 of a mile along on the other side." Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the 1/4 mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. "Find your own lodgings," he had said, "and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown Trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at the head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops in this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of pussy willows, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The pussy willows looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa and several plump armchairs, and in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding-house. There would be beer and darts in the evenings, and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper too. He had stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding-houses, and, to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living-room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go. And now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window, when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. "Bed and breakfast," it said. Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open and a woman was standing there. Normally you ring the bell and you have at least a half-minute's wait before the door opens, but this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward into the house. The compulsion, or, more accurately, the desire to follow after her into that house was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come in out of the cold? How much do you charge?" 5 and 6pence a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay. "If that is too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6pence less without the egg." "5 and sixpence is fine," he answered. "I should like very much to stay here." "I knew you would. Do come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend, welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang it there," she said, "and let me help you with your coat."
We finished the first page of The Landlady by Roald Dahl, and you can already begin to see a theme developing. For instance, look at the characterization of Billy. This is a chap who has a brand new suit, a brand new overcoat to go with it, a new hat. He's looking pretty good. He's looking very successful. He walks very briskly because he believes that walking briskly is a characteristic of success. From appearances, Billy looks like a success. However, we know that he took the slow train down, presumably the cheaper of the trains. We also know he's looking for a cheap hotel. It mentions the word cheap a lot. He prefers the boarding house because it'd be a good bit cheaper. So we're kind of getting an idea of what Billy's like. He isn't successful. He's not rich. He's looking to save money, but he looks successful. Then we start to see a similar thing with the houses and the streets. So we've got this big wide street, huge houses, and pillars. Pillars are often a sign of success. When we think of houses with pillars, we often picture these big rich manor houses in London. Pillars also have sort of connotations with big Roman and Greek architecture, usually temples. However, when we get a bit closer to these houses, we see the facades are cracking, the fronts of them are cracking, the glass is a bit gross. They're just they're not in good condition. Again, we have an idea of these houses from a distance looking the part, but as we get closer, we see that they're not that fancy. Can you start seeing a theme yet? Then we get to the guest house Billy's staying in. Again, from the outside, it looks great. It looks a really nice place to stay. There's flowers, there's a parrot and a little dog, a little sausage dog. It even says animals were usually a good sign in a place like this. Now, you will see that this is a piece of irony. What do you expect? Let's see what actually happens. The expectation isn't matched with the reality. That is irony. We also see the sign which pulls him in like a large black eye. Great simile there. Eyes, big black eyes. What could that symbolize? The fact that it compels him as well. And then we have this woman. She begins to be characterized. She says very pleasantly. She speaks pleasantly. She's very polite. She has a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. She seemed terribly nice. She looked like the mother of a school friend. So she's characterized as appearing very nice, but she pops like a jack-in-the-box, kind of as if she's been waiting for someone. And it says at the end, Billy stepped over the threshold. Now this is interesting because threshold has two definitions. One definition is literally the piece of wood or metal on a door as you walk in. But threshold is also the point of no return. And let's see which one this actually is.
There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest." The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself, but at 5 and sixpence a night, who gives a damn about that? "I should have thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am, of course I am, but the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy and particular, if you see what I mean." "Ah, yes." "But I'm always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along." And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure, when now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who is just exactly right." She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. "Like you," she added, and her blue eyes travelled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body, to his feet, and then up again. On the first-floor landing she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up a second flight. "And this one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?" "No," he said. "It's Weaver." "Oh, Mr. Weaver. How nice. I've put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets. Don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly." "Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you ever so much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed, and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried." "Oh, that's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?" "I'm not a bit hungry, thank you," he said. "I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office." "Very well, then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting-room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we?" She gave him a little wave of the hand, and then went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war, or something like that, and had never got over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living-room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cosy. "I'm a lucky fellow," he thought, rubbing his hands. "This is a bit of all right." He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and, as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. "That's funny," he thought suddenly. "Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those." He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. "Gregory Temple," he said aloud, searching his memory. "Christopher Mulholland. "Ah, such charming boys," a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her, and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. "They sound somehow familiar," he said. "They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that?" "Famous?" she said, setting the tea-tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. "Oh, no, I don't think they were famous, but they were extraordinarily handsome, both of them. I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you." Once more Billy glanced down at the book. "Look here," he said, noticing the dates. "This last entry is over 2 years old." "Is it?"
What sort of vibes are you getting from this landlady? On the first page, she is described as being very wholesome, warm, but on this page, her physical appearance is different to begin with. She has pale lips, which is very different from warm cheeks. Pale obviously lacks warmth, has very negative connotations, or can have negative connotations. Her blue eyes are just described as plain blue eyes on this page. She also describes her home as a nest. It kind of makes me feel that she's a bit like a spider almost. Couple this with the fact that she popped out like a jack-in-the-box when he rung the doorbell makes me picture her as a spider. Again, Billy himself actually trots downstairs at one point as if he's animal fodder about to be killed or slaughtered. Trot is animal imagery, obviously, pigs trot and things like that. She says things like she's always ready, but she's still very polite. "It's always a pleasure, my dear, such a pleasure." I'm getting very weird vibes from her. And she gets his name wrong. She calls him Mr. Perkins. Added to this, Billy also recognises a name in her book, Christopher Mulholland, and he has an idea that it comes from the newspapers. Why could that be? Now, this is all beginning to foreshadow what might happen. Foreshadowing is a literary technique where the author is able to basically give a spoiler to the reader of what is about to happen. So we can kind of see where this is going here. We've got all of these little clues that tell us what's going to happen. She also says things like, the other two guests were tall and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you. They were incredibly handsome. And added, couple this with the fact that these entries are 2 years old. Something doesn't seem right.
"Yes, indeed, and Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years ago." "Dear me," she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. "I would never have thought it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins?" "It's Weaver," Billy said. "Weaver. "Oh, of course it is," she cried, sitting down on the sofa. "How silly of me. I do apologise. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver." "You know something," Billy said, "something that's really quite extraordinary about all this?" "No, dear, I don't." "Well, you see both of these names, Mulholland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean, like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt." "How amusing," she said. "But come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed." "Oh, you really shouldn't bother," Billy said. "I didn't mean you to do anything like that." He stood by the piano watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. "I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them," Billy said. "I'll think of it in a second. I'm sure I will." There is nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. "Now, wait a minute," he said. "Wait just a minute. Mulholland, Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden—" "Milk," she said. "And sugar?" Yes, please. And then all of a sudden—" "Eton schoolboy," she said. "Oh, no, my dear, that can't possibly be right, because Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea's all ready for you." She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there, smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. "There we are," she said. "How nice and cosy this is, isn't it?" Neither of them spoke. But Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts, new leather, or was it the corridors of a hospital? "Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea," she said at length. "Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland." "I suppose he left fairly recently," Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers in the headlines. "Left?" she said, arching her eyebrows. "But, my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together." Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. "How old are you, my dear?" she asked. 17. 17, she cried. "Oh, it's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was, and his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that?" "They're not as good as they look," Billy said. "They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back." "Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older," she said, ignoring his remark. "He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it if he hadn't told me. Never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body." "A what?" Billy said. "His skin was just like a baby's." There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea, then he set it down again gently on its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there, staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. "That parrot," he said at last. "You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive." "Alas, no longer. It's most terribly clever the way it's been done," he said. "It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it?" "I did." "You did? Of course."
Lots more characterisation, lots more foreshadowing, lots more suspense. Okay, so a couple of things. She gets his name wrong again. She calls him Mr. Wilkins this time. How many names have we heard in this story now? There's obviously Weaver, Wilkins, the two names in the book, and the other name she confuses confuses him with. So there's quite a few names. Also, I like this bit here. She had small, white, quickly moving hands. Now, I told you before that in my head, she's almost characterised a bit like a spider. And the hands, to me, almost like spider-like imagery, the way a spider would move. The red fingernails, the colour red, what could that symbolise? Again, Billy's starting to put these things together. He remembers these two names not just separately, but connected as well. Why might you see two names in a newspaper connected, possibly missing? But she's like, no, just don't worry about that. She's very much trying to change the topic of conversation and get him to come and sit with her, have a cup of tea. Again, her description changes a lot. The way she looks at him almost feels very sinister. A half-turned body. He could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him. So the tone is very different here. And he smells something weird as well. Pickled walnuts, new leather, the smell of hospital corridors. He's definitely smelling a chemical smell. So what could that be? Again, more foreshadowing, but she's still very polite, still calls him dear sweet Mr. Mulholland. Then it gets even weirder. The suspense is building even more now. The other guests, they never left. They're still here, both of them, Mr. Temple and Mr. Mulholland. They're on the 3rd floor, apparently, both of them together. Now, I don't know if you remember, but when Billy arrived, he didn't see any hats or coats or umbrellas or walking sticks, no sign of other guests, but apparently they're still there. Again, we see her hands being described as white. White is obviously very different than being described with like warm, rosy cheeks. So a very, very sinister description of her here. Then we get more of this thing adding to one of the major themes that I found. She compliments his teeth, saying how beautiful they are, and he immediately responds with the fact that they're not as good as they look. They've got lots of fillings. Now again, start to think of this theme. The houses look great from a distance, not so great up close. Billy looks successful, actually quite, he's quite cheap and poor. So it's definitely starting to add to this theme. She ignores his remark, and she talks about the other people's skin, the bodies of the other men, without a blemish on their body, like a baby's. Now, honestly, the alliteration that I found here makes me jump at that. Like, it really catches my attention, the alliteration here, the really makes me focus on that. So it adds to the sinister tone, I think. And then we see something else, this huge moment with the parrot. More foreshadowing again. Now, I don't know if you remember, animals were a good sign in a place like this. It said on the first page. The irony is that we expect there to be animals. We find out the animals are in fact dead. They've been stuffed. It had him completely false. He could have sworn it was alive. She is the one who actually stuffed it. Again, more foreshadowing, more warnings from the author of what is to come.
Of course, she said. And have you met my little Basil as well? She nodded towards the dachshund curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, greyish-black and dry and perfectly preserved. "Good gracious," he said, "how absolutely fascinating!" He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. "It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that." "Not in the least," she said. "I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea?" "No, thank you," Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. "You did sign the book, didn't you?" "Oh, yes." "That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple," Billy said. "Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him out of the corners of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile. "No, my dear," she said, "only you." That was The Landlady, read by Nick Martin.
Another cliffhanger. All these short stories seem to end with big cliffhangers. So what happened to Billy? Well, the tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds. I will tell you this now. That alludes to this idea that he has been poisoned. I think arsenic is what tastes of bitter almonds, so that could be arsenic, the poison. Again, we've got this idea of the little dog. Now, put all this together, and what do you think is happening to these people? We've got all these little pieces of information. The 2 guests that are still apparently there, the fact that she's preserving all her animals, and then how does she speak about these young men? They're so handsome, their skin is so perfect, their teeth are amazing. What is she trying to do? Obviously, we've got the fact here, one of the highlighted words on this page, preserved. What is she trying to do? Is she trying to preserve beauty and youth? After reading this story, at what point did you think Billy was going to be murdered? Let me know in the comments section. What themes could you find, and what evidence do you have to support these themes? What did you think of the characterization? How did you feel that developed the themes in the story? Particularly with Billy and the way he looks versus how he actually is, and the landlady, as well as the setting, of course. How did the setting develop a theme? So let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.